Everybody. Thank you, everybody, for being with us today. And I just put into chat some information about the wage and benefit study, including a link also to the compensation tracker on our website. If you haven't had a chance to visit that or to actually see the study, I encourage you to take a look at that. Because we've done this presentation a little bit more with sort of the assumption that people have at least had a look. I wanted to welcome you to us today. I'm Nancy Long. I'm the executive director at 501 Commons. We have with us Greg Scully, who's going to be our orchestra leader here for interaction, and we do hope to have an opportunity to hear from you and take questions and take comments from you. So Greg's going to help us do that. Also with me today is Rita Haronian, who is from Nonprofit Compensation Associates, and I'll introduce Rita a little bit more in just a minute. And Carol McCaulley, who's an HR consultant with 501 Commons. And I see we have Margaret Hanning-Farber on the call as well, who's also a consultant with our HR practice. So thank you all for attending. I'd encourage people to be on screen if you can. It helps it make it feel a little bit more like we're in a community as we're doing this. I also encourage you to use the raise hand function and let us know if you want to make a comment or if you have a question, but also you can put things into chat and Greg or I will try to catch them in chat as well. If neither of those things work, feel free to speak up. We're not that big a group that somebody can't say, oh, hold on a minute, can I ask a question, and just interrupt. So let's see, and we have one person on the call who's having sound issues. Is anybody else having sound problems? Everything's okay? All right. Let us know if any of our speakers are too quiet for you. Let us know. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and work us through. Are you seeing the screen? Because it's not showing. Greg, are you seeing the screen? Yeah, okay. For some reason, I'm not seeing the little line around it. Okay.
Yeah, go on.
Okay, so the wage and benefits study, the nonprofit wage and benefits study is what we're going to talk about today. Still to come is the nonprofit employee engagement survey, which has not been released by the county yet. So I'll say a little bit more about that at the end of the presentation. As I said, this information is in your chat, so you can grab this. We encourage you to share this information in your organization with your board and with other organizations, particularly if you're part of a coalition or an affinity group in your sector. This is a great topic to take up with other organizations that are similar to your own. So with us today are Rita Haronian, who's the principal at Nonprofit Compensation Associates, who actually did the technical work behind the study, created the study, and did the analysis. Carol McCaulley, who's a human resources consultant with 501 Commons. And I've given you both mine and Jenny Ludwig's, who's our project manager's email. If you have any follow-up after this, you're welcome to use that email. And our emails are just simple, just first name and then 501commons.org. So the wage and benefits report was funded by the King County Veteran Seniors and Human Services Levy. The county was interested in finding a way to address turnover problems that they were seeing about 4 years ago in the, particularly in the human services sector. And I guess we could all say they hadn't seen anything yet, right? Compared to where we are today with turnover, not only in our sector, but in the larger economy. So this comes at a time where there's a huge amount of turmoil in the environment, huge amount of wage inflation going on around us, creating even more acute problems than we have had for generations in the nonprofit sector around having competitive benefits and pay available to employees in our sector. The purpose of the study is really to illustrate the current nonprofit compensation and benefit practices. This doesn't represent what ought to be, but what is. And it was focused on King County organizations or organizations that serve King County. But I think it has wide applicability with some adjustment for geographic differences in other in a broader geographic area because there's so much data available through it. Our goal is really to help nonprofits offer competitive compensation and benefits and to maintain equitable compensation practices given the resource limitations that we operate with. We had very good participation in this first initial survey. We hope to even improve upon that when the next survey is repeated, which will be in 2023. But we received data on 10,000 jobs, which were categorized into 171 jobs that are reported out in the report. And Rita can give you the details around the rationale behind this, but basically for data reliability, compensation for job titles that reported less than five organizations are not included. And so you'll see areas where we might have had data, but not enough data to meet that threshold. And so there's data is not shared if it's not considered to meet that reliable level of data reliability. We are lucky to have the opportunity to contract with Rita Haronian, who is the co-founder and principal at Nonprofit Compensation Associates. They have done more than 50 nonprofit compensation studies, so she really is the leading expert in the US on this kind of work. And she uses a methodology called Fair Pay to look at nonprofit salary and benefits. 501 Commons did the outreach, and that outreach over about 4 months included reaching about 5,000 executives, in addition to finance and HR leads in nonprofits and people who we felt were influential in the nonprofit sector and could help get the word out about the wage and benefit study and also the employee engagement survey. We feel like this is a call to action for our sector, and of course, exactly what action and what result we might get from taking those actions is still unclear and something we need to all join hands and work together on. I think we have the interests of King County government. We potentially can gain the interests of other units of government, of foundations, and if we take our case to them, also individual donors to make some changes that would help us address this problem of being able to provide livable wages and benefits in the nonprofit sector at minimum, and really benefits and wages that support a career in our sector long term. So there are a couple areas of recommendations that we have in the report, and I'll review those with you. But I want you, as you're listening to these, to be thinking about what's the answer to the question about what more or what's next, because this is not by any means sufficient to change the current conditions in our sector locally or nationally. The first thing would be for funders to adopt a position that they support the full cost of services being provided by nonprofits, including wages and benefits that are comparable to related sectors like government, education, health, and philanthropy. I think it's important that that is the way that we position ourselves as a sector. rather than salaries that are like the business sector. Things get very confusing in trying to benchmark to the business sector because, first of all, small businesses have salaries pretty similar to the nonprofit sector, particularly small retail, service industry businesses. And really where the issue is for our sector is we lose employees to those related sectors where people go to government because they can get better pay and benefits. They go into the larger parts of the nonprofit community, the large education and healthcare organizations, and into philanthropy. Together, we were all the nonprofit sector, government, and those other areas. And it's the community-based nonprofits, like most of you, or almost all of you who are on the call today, where the pay differential is so significant, and that is baked into the practices of government, of foundations, and of individual donors. We would expect that government would contract with or provide grants to nonprofits, similar like they do when they're contracting with businesses. So nobody expects the people who maintain the copy machines at the state government to provide their services for 40% of cost. No, the city doesn't expect outside consultants to come in and offer them a 60% discount to provide consulting services and so forth. And similar for donors, donors wouldn't expect that when they buy a cup of coffee, that 100% of that money that they're paying goes to coffee beans. They know there's a lot of other things that goes into the process of making a cup of coffee, and they're happy to pay for those other things because they realize that they are necessary. So we want to encourage government and philanthropy to state their intentions to support the full cost of services, including salaries that are reasonable salaries, and particularly assuring that the salaries that are at the bottom of our sector come up to the living wage level, not minimum wage, but a living wage. And one of the ways they can do that is just inquiring whether the applicants' salaries are above the living wage, just showing an interest in there being fair and reasonable payment of salaries in the sector. That's obviously problematic if they're not willing to pay the full costs. And often with philanthropy, they're paying such a tiny slice of the cost of services, even if they were paying the full cost for the particular services they're funding under a grant. It doesn't solve the economic problem that we have in the sector. So it's complicated, but these are things that we're recommending as first steps. Let me stop for a minute and see if there are comments or suggestions that relate to this call to action for funders. Who's going to be the brave first speaker here? What else could funders do? What else could foundations do? What else could government do?
Hi, this is Susan Brown with Kids Co. And what I'm wondering about is, unless something has changed, I don't know that funders generally want to fund wages. So although I understand, that is the highest percentage component of our budget. So I'm just curious how we also make that shift, because our services, the full cost is really mostly staff.
Yeah, in fact, for most nonprofits, staff and related costs, wages and benefits and related taxes and so forth is about 65% of a budget. And I think one of the things that you have to get through with philanthropy in particular is the idea that money somehow does the work, and you spend time in the philanthropic sector, the conversation is often about what philanthropy is doing, what their money is doing. In reality, money doesn't do the work. People do the work. And so it's really up to us, I think, Susan, that in writing proposals, we are clear that there are no programs in most cases unless there are people. Sometimes those people are volunteers, and much of our sector is funded entirely by the labor of volunteers, which I'll mention in a minute, but it still is true that it's people that have to be supported to do the work that our sector does. And in many cases, for the organizations that are seeking grant funds, it's people who are drawing a salary. And so if nonprofits are kind of trying to hide that, and you see that more with the conversation between nonprofits and individual donors. So nonprofits will promise, 100% of your donation will go directly to services, services to people. And, we don't spend anything on overhead. We don't spend, there's no costs outside of direct service. Well, that's just not actually the way the world works. And anybody who works in government or works in business or, works in our sector knows that. So we're really promoting an idea that is sort of a trope in our community, but isn't real, and it doesn't serve us. So being explicit that salaries are needed to accomplish the work that you're asking for funding, and this is what it costs, and that cost should be not just salaries, but also benefits and also taxes and related costs. It also takes overhead, right? It also takes the people who are not involved in the program, but do the finances, do the HR, take care of the facility, take care of computers, all those other things. And we should be explicit that all of that is a part of what it takes to provide the services that we provide. Any other thoughts about how to deal with that issue about we don't want to fund salaries, we just want to fund programs? Any of you had that conversation recently with a funder?
Nancy, I sympathize with the feeling like that's been a long, like funders have long held that view. I really do feel like that's changed quite a bit. I have to say that we really don't get any pushback. I mean, we incorporate salaries into all of our budgets when we do it. And I would encourage people to use your budget as a storytelling tool when you are providing information to funders. And by that, I do mean the full cost of the program. So your rent, the hours that volunteers spend on that program, and the value of those hours. A lot of times people are like, well, couldn't they get volunteers to help with that? If you're showing that you are getting volunteers to help with that, and those people need to be managed and they need to be, I feel like people are a little like savvier. Do you know what I mean? I just don't have the experience that people are really pushing back as hard on salaries anymore. I really don't find that personally, but we do always incorporate the full cost of overhead into every program request for funding.
Yeah, we're encouraging funders that if they do ask for a budget, like if they give you a budget format, which is not a very considerate thing for them to do, but many do that, that they have a line for salaries, a line for benefits, a line for taxes for the personnel costs, a line for program administration, and then a line for overhead or an overhead percentage that they're expecting to be put onto the budget. That's the way the real world works. Why are we pretending it works some other magic way where nonprofits somehow have access to resources that don't show up with dollar signs on a budget? Any other ideas or any other experience that you want to share? Anybody that's had an experience specifically around what Susan was talking about, where somebody goes, oh, well, I don't want to pay for staff? Or anybody who's had a conversation with a funder that goes directly to Susan's experience about if you raise it, then you find that they're understanding and amenable to paying for salaries.
Hi, this is Lillian with Latino Community Fund, and I think I've seen the willingness and openness from funders to have to fund more on the salaries, but I also think the willingness, wanting them to also be advocates for it and not just be okay with the nonprofit sector coming and saying this is what we need. But I think that funders are going to be the more likely to be able to convince other funders of that. And so to actually be, to really be in it with us in terms of advocates for it, and to talk to their other, to talk to other funders. And I think there's also, what message can funders provide that can support in our conversations, even with our boards, who may not know as much around some of the data. And maybe there might be board members who think, well, it's nonprofit, so this is what salaries should look like. But for funders to actually be advocates in that, and how they can maybe push for the need for us to be paying these livable wages.
Yes, and Lillian, organizations like Latino Community Fund, like Potlatch, I think are like Pride, are particularly in a good position to be powerful allies on this issue, because you have those connections within philanthropy, but these very, very close ties with community-based organizations, and with the impacts that those organizations are having on communities. So I appreciate what you just said very much. I think, you know, it's interesting, this idea that, you know, these are nonprofit wages, this is what people should be paid, they should be lower wages, is really something we need to challenge. And I think for many people in the sector, that's a very personal challenge. I spoke to a group earlier last week, and it included someone who's been in the sector for her whole life, and really had an attitude that's pretty common in us boomers, which is the sort of self-sacrifice kind of approach to the nonprofit lifestyle. And that is really not reasonable. The world has changed around us. You can't have subpar wages in our sector and have people be able to, you know, stay in the sector and have their career, build their career in the sector, because access to housing, access to, you know, education, access to resources is very, very different than when it was when I came up in the sector, when my family was basically raised through the nonprofit sector. So we need to really challenge that thinking. I think it comes, and it has a historical origin in the fact that the nonprofit sector used to be called the volunteer sector. And it used to be run by women who presumably were being supported by their husbands, and their work was voluntary. And only, you know, occasionally would they bring in somebody who would be paid sort of a pittance wage to get involved in the work. And as the nonprofit sector started to professionalize and get bigger and more formalized, men started running those organizations, particularly at the national level, and started earning salaries at the executive level. We're still carrying around a lot of the baggage of that time, that idea that we are the charity sector, and we the first place that charity starts is with the people who work in the sector. And we really need to challenge our thinking about that, and challenge those longstanding ideas. So let's turn to what nonprofits can do. So one of the things we can do is support our employees by benchmarking salaries to organizations similar. That doesn't solve the overall problem, because you still have limited funding in the system, but it at least starts to say that we have some standard of reference that we're using in the sector, and that's exactly what this study is intended to provide you with the resource to do. You can determine a percentage benchmark that you can achieve now, and you can set a goal to achieve a higher benchmark. And that, I think, is an important part of communication with staff, and an important part of planning for an organization. Is, you know, we may have these limitations, but rather than just say, oh, well, this is all the money we have, We have to get as much service as we can out of it. Therefore, we have to pay low wages. To actually plan a process and benchmarking using competitive data like is provided in this report is one of the ways to do that. You can try to implement a salary base that's equal to or above the living wage, just so those very lowest salaries in our sector can be brought up. And you can address operational practices that go on related to recruiting, hiring, and promotions that perpetuate discriminatory pay, particularly for BIPOC, foreign-born, people with disabilities, women in some fields, and other populations that tended to be allowed to exist in our sector at the kind of the lowest end of the wages and be treated in a differential way, sometimes because they're not being aggressive in self-advocacy, and we let that kind of carry the day in terms of what we pay people. And we're going to talk more about that. So a little bit about characteristics of the participants. This is primarily to indicate that we looked at the results in terms of how representative are these results for our sector. And the first thing I want to point out is that 85% of the nonprofits in Washington State are have no employees whatsoever. Everything is being done by volunteers. And so the lowest wage in our sector is literally zero. That's what most people in our sector are being paid today. And that's always been true. So we need to realize that for the 15% of nonprofits that are paying wages, that have at least one employee, you can address a part of the problem in our sector by raising wages in that small portion. But we actually need to look at the equity issues around the fact that, particularly in rural areas of our state, the vast majority of nonprofits have no personnel, have no paid personnel. And that's the kind of the bigger issue around the pay issue that we're currently focusing on. So when we look at the characteristics of the participants, these are kind of normative expectations for where staff budget, staff size, and executive pay would be in terms of that portion of the sector that does have paid employees. And then I also just added the voluntary turnover rate here, which I think these numbers in the teens look very desirable at this point, since most organizations are experiencing voluntary turnover rates higher than this. And in the business sector, the last number I saw was at I think 26% on voluntary, not counting the people who turn over involuntarily. So I'm going to turn this over to Rita, who's going to talk about using the compensation data and understanding the compensation tables that are in the report. There's some documentation in the report about how to use them as well, and some kind of wayfinding tools, but I think it'll be really helpful to you to hear from Rita. So Rita, and I'll move advance the slides for you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so this slide lists the elements on these compensation pages. The format of each page is the same for each of the 171 jobs that we received enough data to report in the survey. So we have a little chart that that points out what these elements are, and I'm gonna just go through them and describe what they mean. I think some of it will be familiar to some of you, but not necessarily all of it. So the idea is to just describe what you're looking at when you look at any one of these pages. Yeah, here we go. So as Nancy said, the idea here is to take a snapshot of the local employment market so nonprofit managers can make informed decisions about how to use your resources, attracting and retaining well-qualified employees, avoiding turnover to the extent possible, maintaining equitable practices. So this is just an example of what's on each of the pages. You'll see the name of the job, the survey job title at the top, which isn't always the same, of course, as the job title used at any organization, but we have a survey job title that we use for reference, and the job description. The job descriptions are written with the idea that most organizations will recognize their jobs in the survey job descriptions. Sometimes, especially at a small organization, there might be one employee who has a job that encompasses more than one survey job. That's not unusual. At very large organizations, they may have multiple levels of one of our survey jobs, but most organizations can find reasonably close matches to most of their jobs among the survey jobs. And that's the aim of how the job descriptions are put together. I think it's important though to note that each organization is unique. Jobs that are similar among different organizations may be largely the same in terms of their functions, but not identical. So when you're looking at external market data, which that's what this survey data is, we're looking at the external employment market, it's also worth taking into account any internal equity considerations that are relevant for your organization, because those considerations also enter into decisions about setting pay levels. So if we look on this slide across the top of the chart, we'll see the number of organizations that reported at least one employee in this job. And as Nancy mentioned, our threshold is 5 organizations. That's for reliability, and it's also for confidentiality, and it's also for compliance with guidelines about using survey data. Obviously the more data we collect, the more reliable it is. And we found that 5 is a good threshold amount. So we want at least 5 organizations. Some report more than one employee in a job, some report just one. As long as there are 5 organizations, then the information on that line is, at least some of the information is displayed, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then we have the total number of employees reported by all these organizations. And then we have the percentiles. So we start at the 10th percentile and go through the 90th percentile. Percentiles are calculated by ordering all the individual pay numbers from lowest to highest, and then picking the number that's in a particular position. So as an example, you can visualize if there are 100 employee pay levels reported for a particular job and you order them, then the 10th percentile will be the one that's 10 up from the bottom. And the 25th percentile is telling us what the person in position 25 from the bottom is paid. The 50th percentile is also referred to as the median. Those are 2 things that mean the same. That's the pay of the person who's right in the middle of the whole group when they're ordered from lowest to highest. So the percentiles are reported here to give us a sense about how pay data is distributed among the entire group. And the percentiles provide perspective that we wouldn't get if we looked at just what's in the middle of the sample. So the median is a way to look at what's in the middle of the sample. The averages are also a way to look at what's in the middle of the sample. There are 2 average calculations here. The average by employee is what we normally think of as the average. You add all the numbers together and divide by however many distinct numbers there were in the group. So each employee's pay is given equal weight. And then the last column, average by by organization instead gives each organization equal weight. So it doesn't matter how many employees each of these organizations reports, we get one number from each organization. If there's more than one employee, it'd be the average of all of their employees, and put that each organization number in a sample together and take the average of that. So the reason for doing that is that sometimes one organization reports many more employees in a particular job than other organizations. And if you don't look at this number as well, then that one organization can have a very significant influence over the average by employee calculation. So it's useful to also look at the average by organization. And in some cases, when that proportion coming from one organization is quite high, that's the only number that we report, because even the percentiles and also the average by employee would be very strongly pulled by one organization's responses. You'll also see that if we got less than 12 employees total reported on a line, we don't report the 10th, 25th, 75th, or 90th percentiles, only the median, the average by employee, and the average by organization, just because when there's that little data, slicing and dicing to the point of reporting those more detailed percentiles is less reliable. So not necessarily numbers that one should refer to. Okay, so across those are the numbers, the headings across the top, and then you'll see in the chart the first group of lines are dealing with the sample as a whole. So all the organizations reporting all their employees as a whole. The base salary is on that first line. And then we've asked for the number of employees who are eligible for any sort of bonus or incentive pay. It tells us how many organizations had at least one person and how many people were identified as potentially eligible for incentive or bonus pay. And then the third line is the actual amounts paid for those people who actually did receive incentive or bonus pay in the last year. So there were people who were eligible who didn't receive anything. So those numbers are calculated based on the bonuses that people actually received. And then the fourth line is the total cash, which for each individual person adds their base salary and any bonus incentive pay they did receive if they did. That's the first group of lines on the top of the chart. And then we have only the first section under that is shown here. The annual expenses of the organization broken out in categories. And these numbers are all base salary numbers at this point. Farther down on the page, not this example page, but the actual pages, we report base salaries, here we go, by the organization's field of service, by the number of full-time equivalent employees at the organization, and then by one parameter that has to do with the job and not by an organization characteristic, but the number of full-time equivalent employees who are managed by the person in this job. So you'll see on any particular page, sometimes there are a lot of lines reported. The program manager example here, we have quite a bit of data. The driver example, much less data. To some extent, that just has to do with the fact that many more organizations have program managers than drivers. But having more participants in the survey means that we will be able to report information about more jobs altogether. And for jobs that we do report, we will have relatively more lines of data to report. So that results in just a richer amount of information that can be displayed on these pages. And we are, of course, hoping that when the survey is repeated next year, that we will have even more participants in the survey and we'll be able to report more information. You'll also see on some of the compensation pages that not all of those sections appear. So the annual expenses, the field of service, the number of full-time equivalent employees, and the number of full-time equivalent employees managed, those sections don't appear if there wasn't sufficient data to display information for at least one line in the section. So that's why some of the pages have a different formatting. But the information, the type of information presented is the same for each of the pages.
And it's particularly important for you to get the folks that are in your particular field of service involved in participating in the survey when we repeat it, because then you get data back that gives you comparison for other folks in your field. So you'll see that because this was done with the involvement of King County Veterans Seniors and Human Services Levy, that we had better participation in those fields because the county was essentially requiring, not really, but sort of requiring that people participate. But we really want to be able to get you data for all the other fields where that's missing. So one of the things we're really excited about with the release of this of the survey is also the release of the 501 compensation tracker on our website. Any of you that have worked with these kind of survey tools in the past know that it can be a little tedious, particularly because, as Rita just noted, in many organizations, particularly smaller and mid-sized organizations, jobs are sort of mixed jobs. So somebody's doing a part of one job title and parts of two other job titles, and you often, in order to get a reasonable salary, you need to look at the components of those different job activities that they're engaged with. This makes it really easy to do that without having to kind of flip through page by page and look up each time where all these pages are in a document online or paper document. And what you can do is you can put, 2 or 3 or 4, this goes on, but I've given you one example of if somebody's not quite an accounting clerk, but they're not quite an accounting manager, and you want to try to figure out how to benchmark their job to a sort of a mix, like 3/4 accounting clerk and 1/4 manager. This gives you a really easy way to do this online and to compare salaries. Because this is all public information, so all this information is free, thanks to King County. The website is free and open to everyone. It also means that nonprofit employees can go and look at different jobs and compare what the wages are, how many people are in those jobs as shown in the report. So how prevalent are the jobs in the sector? So we hope it will be used as a career development tool for nonprofit employees or people who are interested in coming into our sector as well. So be sure and go and check that out. You can just search 501 compensation tracker, or on our website, all of these tools and reports and so forth are under a page called Putting People First, is the other way to find that. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about compensation practices. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I just want to show you the titles of some of the information that's in the report, because in addition to the 171 pages of the wage study, there's a report about compensation practices, a report on benefits practices, a special section on executive director pay and benefits, and a section on the economic impact of COVID as well. So we don't have time to go into all of those, but you can see that there's information that helps you sort of benchmark on how, for instance, evening and night differentials shift differentials are handled in different organizations. So if that's relevant for you, it gives you an idea about what other similar organizations are doing. There's information such as how nonprofits decide around salary increases, which is sort of all over the map. Each of these methods has its upsides and its downsides as a method for figuring out salary increases. And I want to point out that Rita recommends that as you're looking at salaries in the report, the way that they're shown in the report, that you advance these salaries by a minimum of 0.25 for every month since March, which is when we started collecting data last year. And this would provide you with a 3% annualized increase. If you want to assume a higher increase, we don't know what it precisely will be for 2021, but if you want to assume a higher increase, obviously you can do that, but you need to add an adjustment to the numbers. There's some discussion of compensation practices. I'll use as an example that salary grades and ranges, which is a really important aspect of a compensation a policy and compensation design. And it shows you that 43% of organizations are using those as tools in their compensation structure. This is something we will probably be delving into later this year to help people learn how to to develop compensation policy and to have a more fully built out compensation structure that you can use to try to assure that you provide people with some advancement opportunities in your organization and that you're paying people fairly across the organization. An emerging practice example is bilingual pay, where only 99% of organizations are currently paying a premium for bilingual skills when they are required to be used in the job on a regular basis. And this is a practice, an example of a practice that we think organizations should look at and evaluate in their compensation practices. We also are making a recommendation that organizations set a base salary at the living wage for your community. There is in the report a reference to both the living wage standard, but also another standard that has been developed at UW. So there's some resources you can use to establish this, but to make it clear, a living wage is not the minimum wage. That when you're paying somebody minimum wage, you're basically paying them a wage that puts them in poverty. The living wage is a calculation of basic needs plus taxes, and it includes things like childcare, food, housing, medical, and so forth. And it was developed by MIT, and every year they update their calculation for communities across the US. So there is a calculation specifically for the Seattle King County community. The 2021 wage would put, and it's different for different family sizes, but just as an example, it puts a single person's living wage right at about $20. And I think we all know that would be $20 is pretty tough as a salary to live in our community. So this is by no means a comfortable living, but it is what they calculate to at least allow people to live and pay those basic expenses. We did a special analysis to look at the jobs that were below living wage in our community in the report, and the data that came through in the report. And these probably don't surprise you as the kinds of jobs that come up that are currently being paid below the living wage in our sector. So another really important issue, and Rita mentioned this before, and I wanted Carol McCaulley to help us dig into this a little bit, is the ability to assure that we have pay equity within our organizations. So the external pay equity uses these benchmarks to say, are we paying what other similar organizations are paying in our geography? But there are also issues of how we're paying people within the organization. So Carol, I'll turn this to you.
Great. So I'm going to cover briefly it's a really important element to compensation in the state of Washington, and that's our pay equity laws. And while many have struggled with this changes that took place in 2018, nonprofits I have found to be much more open to it. So I wanted to take just a few minutes to go over it today. Because when the pay equity law was amended in 2018, there was a lot of attention immediately to don't ask questions about your current compensation when you're hiring somebody. And maybe you have to make some compensation information available to a new hire or to someone you're promoting. That word got out pretty well. But what didn't get out as well is what I think was a very critical change in it. And that is that you can't base pay just on job descriptions. You can't look for pay equity just by comparing people within your organization based on their job descriptions. If anyone was doing pay equity before, that's what they would be inclined to do. They'd get their salary survey information. They'd put everybody into a spreadsheet, take a look at it, see who people with the same title, how they came to, how they looked against each other based on largely seniority. Sometimes they would look at some protected characteristics. But Washington law says you have to look at similar employment. And this time, unlike in 1948, they defined what similar employment means. And that means anyone who's working for the same employer and their job requires similar skill, effort, responsibility, and is done in a similar working condition. That's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to even manage, but that's what we're called to do because we know that in job descriptions, we have people who are predominantly, a certain job title has been held predominantly by people of one gender or another. And so even by using surveys, you're perpetuating a historic bias because that compensation that's reflected there reflects that historic bias. So it continues. So that's why Washington asked us to look beyond that, to look at these four factors and the working conditions. They do allow for some differentiation between compensation based on true bona fide factors, things like seniority, productivity, geographic location, but they have to truly be job related and they have to account for the entire difference in the compensation. So there's some pretty hefty penalties associated with not doing this. So it can come back to bite pretty hard. And we don't know yet how courts are going to interpret all of this. I went and looked just this morning to see any chance of there being any decisions yet. And I didn't find any. I did find an opinion from a summary judgment case here in the state of Washington. And the employer fared well in it, but it involved a position where he looked very carefully and the two positions had very clearly different responsibilities. So the judge threw it out based on the summary judgment that the two jobs were not similar in responsibility. So that's a factor you have to look at. I know that we're really short on time, so I'm not going to go into it any deeper, but keep in mind, be sure to take a look at your compensation philosophies, because I could tell you most of the ones that I see today still reflect, we're going to go out, we're going to do a salary, we're going to look at salary surveys, and we're going to pay at such percentage of what the survey data shows. That's not going to comply with Washington law. So you want to make sure that both your compensation philosophy and your practices mirror that law, so that not only are you complying with the law and you're not going to get big expenses in the future for claims, but more because it's the right thing to do. And as nonprofits, that's what we're about. So that's pay equity.
So we will delve into this in the future some more and provide some more resources about this. But does anybody have a question right now for Carol?
Could you try again?
That's Siri.
Any questions? Let's see, Laura is citing a new law just passed this session that expanded pay equity protections and requires employers with more than 15 staff to disclose the salary range for all postings.
Right.
So SB 5761. So more to come, and as we delve into that. Thank you, Laura. Laura Pierce from Washington Nonprofits, by the way. If you're not a member of nonprofits, please join. If you're not a member of Washington Nonprofits, please join. A big part of the solution to the issues that we're talking about today has to do with us gathering together and taking collective action to support better conditions in our sector. So a little bit about benefits, again, just to show you that this information is there and available to you. The good news is that in terms of medical coverage, 85% of nonprofits are offering some kind of medical coverage to full-time employees. There are hopefully some opportunities that can be developed in the future to advance that to 100% to help particularly organizations that have very few employees get access to coverage. Retirement, 70% of organizations are providing some kind of retirement benefit. That doesn't mean the employer is contributing necessarily, but making a retirement plan available to employees. And there's a lot more detail in the report on these questions. A lot of information on time off practices, which is an opportunity. People are using separate vacation, sick leave, and holiday benefits as an opportunity to take a look at what some of the data says about the PTO approach as an option for you to consider and for you to benchmark to other organizations in the sector in terms of days, holidays, and allowing people to donate paid time off and practices such as those. I want to ask you as we close up today to please promote this report and discussion in your community, particularly like say in your area of interest or your field of service, so that we can get this discussion going at a lot of different levels in the organization, in our sector, and in organizations that you're also promoting discussion with your employees and with your board. I think employees can be quite understanding of the limitations that we deal with in nonprofits, but we should be having the conversation with our employees. They can be part of the solution potentially in helping us convince funders and donors and government to expand the resources that are available to help us do the work that we do with the staff who are dedicated to our organizations and to the community they serve. So we encourage you to reach out and talk to legislators, to council members, people in philanthropy as well. The study gives you a lot of information to draw from, but if you want any help from us, if there's any way that we can help you get ready for that kind of discussion, please reach out and let me know, because I think it really is going to take all of us raising this issue to try to use this data to help shape the future, because right now it's just telling us the story of the past. Where were we? But the question is, where do we want to go and how are we going to get there? And that is going to take all of us, and it's going to take a long and pretty difficult conversation. So I will, I'll stay on for a few minutes. If people want to stay on and answer any questions, be sure and look at chat. I can see that there's a conversation with our wonderful Margaret Hanning Farber about pay equity here, and some offerings from Laura with some information about that new law. So take a look at chat before you leave. And thank you for being with us today. Stay tuned as we have other work sessions, kind of getting down to some of the details on some of these issues. and stay tuned as we continue to try to advance the conversation to the broader sector. Thank you, everybody, for being here.